I watched her paint the walls of my house for 6 months, putting all her savings into the renovation, knowing she'd never spend a single night in it once the paperwork cleared. If you want to know how I let my greedy stepmother bankrupt herself renovating a house she didn't actually own, stay with me until the end. My name is Sarah. I'm 32, and honestly, I never thought I'd be the type of person who would let someone walk into a trap like that. I'm an archivist by trade. I deal with paper, with history, with preserving the truth. I like order. I like rules. But when you're dealing with a woman like Linda, rules don't apply. Or rather, she thinks they don't apply to her. And that was her mistake. Because if there is one thing I know how to do, it's how to trace a timeline until I find the one thread that unravels the whole sweater. Basically, you have to understand that this didn't start with the will. It didn't start with the money. It started way back when my dad first met her. My mom had passed about 5 years prior, and Dad was just lonely. He was this gentle, soft-spoken man who loved gardening and old jazz records, and he was walking around with this giant hole in his chest that he was desperate to fill. Enter Linda. She was loud. She was colorful. She wore this perfume that smelled like synthetic vanilla and burnt sugar, and it clung to everything. Like, literally, she would leave a room, and the air would still feel heavy with her. At first, I tried to be happy for him. I really did. I saw him smiling again, and I told myself that was all that mattered. But then, the little things started happening. It was subtle at first, kind of like a slow leak in a tire. You don't notice it until you're driving on the rim. She started changing things in the house. Small stuff. The curtains in the living room. The pictures on the mantel. Slowly, the photos of my mom started migrating to the back of the shelf, then to the drawer, then to the attic. When I asked her about it, she gave me this wide, fake smile. It didn't reach her eyes, just stretched her mouth like a rubber band, and she basically told me that she just wanted to freshen up the energy in the place. And I'm sitting there thinking, it's not the energy you're changing, it's the history. Then came her son, Derek. He was 25, unemployed, and had this permanent look of boredom on his face. Linda moved him into the guest room temporarily while he got back on his feet. 6 months later, he was still there, eating my dad's food, parking his beat-up sedan on the lawn, and treating my father like a live-in landlord. The atmosphere in the house shifted from warm to hostile. It felt like I was walking into a stranger's territory every time I visited. The smell of Dad's pipe tobacco was gone, replaced by that cloying vanilla and the chemical sting of cleaning products Linda used to scrub away any trace of the life we had before her. Have you ever walked into your childhood home and realized with a sinking feeling that you don't actually have a key to the new locks? Because that's what happened next. I went over one Tuesday to drop off some groceries for Dad. He was getting frailer by then, his heart wasn't great, and my key wouldn't turn. It just jammed in the cylinder. I knocked, and Linda answered the door in her bathrobe, looking annoyed that I was interrupting her morning coffee. And here is where it gets crazy. She didn't even apologize. She just leaned against the doorframe, blocking my view of the hallway, and casually mentioned that they had to change the locks because there had been break-ins in the neighborhood. She said she meant to get me a copy, but she must have forgotten. But the way she said it, it wasn't an apology. It was a boundary. She was telling me, without saying the words, that I was a guest now, and guests need to be invited. I tried to push past it. For Dad. I kept my mouth shut because I could see how tired he was. He was shrinking. Literally shrinking. His clothes hung off him like they belonged to a bigger man. And every time I tried to get 5 minutes alone with him, Linda was there. Hovering. She would come into the room with tea, or she would sit right next to him and hold his hand so tight his knuckles turned white, interjecting in every conversation. If I asked Dad how he was feeling, Linda would answer for him. She'd say he was doing great, just a little tired. She'd say the doctor was happy with his progress. And Dad would just sit there, nodding vaguely, looking like he wanted to say something, but didn't have the energy to fight her volume. It was psychological warfare. I'd call his cell phone, and she would answer. She'd give me these long, winding excuses about why he couldn't come to the phone. He was napping. He was in the bath. He was watching his show. I mean, honestly, it got to the point where I started tracking the times I called, just to prove to myself I wasn't going crazy. My body started reacting to the stress before my brain fully acknowledged what was happening. I wasn't sleeping. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. with my heart hammering against my ribs, thinking about him alone in that house with her. My hair started shedding in the shower, clumps of it clogging the drain. I had this constant low-grade nausea, like I had swallowed a stone. And get this, the money started disappearing too. Dad had a solid pension, plus savings. But suddenly, cash flow was an issue. Linda would pull me aside in the kitchen, lowering her voice to this conspiratorial whisper, and tell me that Dad's medications were so expensive and the insurance wasn't covering enough. She'd ask if I could chip in for the groceries or the electric bill. So I did. I transferred money. I bought the expensive prescriptions. I filled the fridge. And then, a week later, I'd see a new package from a designer store sitting on the counter. Or Derek would be playing a brand new gaming console in the living room. I felt like I was screaming underwater. I tried to talk to Dad about it once. Just once. Linda was out at the store. I sat by his bed. He was bedridden mostly by then, and I took his hand. It felt like paper. I asked him if he was okay with how she was handling the money. For a second, looking at him, I didn't see the frail old man. I saw the dad who used to teach me how to balance a checkbook at the kitchen table. The dad who saved every receipt. I missed that dad so much it physically hurt my chest. He squeezed my hand, weak but there, and he looked at me with these watery, desperate eyes. He whispered that he had it handled. He told me not to worry. He said, and I remember this clearly, "The safety box, Sarah. I left it all in the box." That was the last real conversation we had. 2 weeks later, the ambulance was in the driveway. Have you ever realized that the person supposed to be caring for your loved one is actually just waiting for them to die so they can cash out? The grief was suffocating, but Linda was efficient. That's the only word for it. At the funeral, she played the grieving widow perfectly. She wore this massive black hat and dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. She accepted condolences with a tragic nod, leaning heavily on Derek, who looked uncomfortable in a suit that clearly didn't fit him. But I was watching her. I was watching the way her eyes darted around the room, assessing who was there, calculating. She wasn't mourning a husband. She was hosting a networking event. I remember standing by the grave, the dirt still fresh, and feeling this cold, hard knot form in my stomach. I looked at her, and I didn't feel sadness anymore. I felt clarity. The bridge words in my head switched from, maybe she's just stressed, to, she is going to try to take everything. Long story short, I was right. We hadn't even ordered the headstone before she called the family meeting. She summoned me to the house. My house. The house my mother designed. The house my father paid for with 40 years of labor. I walked in, and the smell of paint thinner hit me instantly. She had already started. There were swatches on the wall. The furniture was pushed to the center of the room, covered in plastic. She sat me down at the dining room table, the one my grandpa built, and she pushed a folder toward me. She didn't look sad. She looked triumphant. She looked like a cat that just swallowed the canary and is waiting for you to notice the feathers. She told me, with this faux sympathetic tilt of her head, that Dad had made some changes right before the end. She said he felt that I was established enough on my own, and that he wanted to make sure she and Derek were taken care of. I opened the folder. And there it was, the last will and testament. It was dated 3 days before he died. 3 days, when he was on high-dose morphine, when he couldn't even hold a spoon, let alone a pen. The document was short. It left the house, the savings, the car, Eakin and the pension entirely to Linda. It left me my fond memories. My ears started ringing, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the hum of the refrigerator. My hands went ice cold. I looked at the signature. It was shaky. It looked like a spider crawled across the page in ink. She was watching me, waiting for the explosion. She wanted me to scream. She wanted me to call her a liar so she could play the victim, so she could say I was the greedy daughter causing a scene. But I didn't scream. I closed the folder. I took a deep breath, inhaling that toxic mix of vanilla and paint fumes, and I looked at her. "Okay," I said. Her face fell for a split second. She wasn't expecting, "Okay." "Okay?" she repeated, blinking. "If this is what Dad wanted," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady, forcing my hands to stop trembling under the table, "then I respect it." I stood up to leave. I needed air. I needed to get away from her before I vomited. But as I turned to go, I saw it. Her laptop was open on the sideboard. The screen was dark, but the power light was blinking. And that's when the shift happened. The sadness evaporated, and something cold and sharp took its place. I remembered what Dad said. The safety box. He knew. He knew she would do this. I walked out of that house, and for the first time in months, I didn't cry. I sat in my car, gripped the steering wheel, and watched her shadow move across the window as she went back to her painting. She thought she had won. She thought the war was over. She didn't know I was just waiting for the right moment to nuke the battlefield. I sat in my car around the corner from the house for what must have been an hour. I couldn't drive. My legs were shaking so bad I couldn't feel the pedals. I just stared at the steering wheel, gripping it until my knuckles turned white, trying to process the absolute audacity of what had just happened. Basically, my brain was trying to reconcile two different realities. Reality A, my father, the man who taught me that honesty was the only currency that mattered, had secretly decided to disinherit his only child in favor of a woman he'd known for 4 years. Reality B, Linda was lying through her veneers. Obviously, reality B was the truth, but knowing it and proving it are two very different things. I replayed the image of that document in my head. The last will. It was too clean, too perfect. The language was flowery and legalistic, full of hereby and aforementioned, words my dad never used. He was a man of few words. His emails were like haikus. Love, Dad. Good job. Call me. The idea that he would dictate a 3-page treatise on the distribution of his estate while dying of liver failure was laughable. And the signature. That was the thing that really stuck with me. It looked traced. It had that shaky quality, sure, which you could blame on the medication, but it lacked the pressure points. You know how when someone signs their name, there's a rhythm to it? Heavy on the downstroke, light on the curve? This was flat. It was a drawing of a signature, not the act of signing. I mean, honestly, the sheer disrespect of it made me want to go back in there and tear the house apart. But I knew I couldn't. If I reacted, if I screamed, if I hired a lawyer right then and there to storm the castle, she would bunker down. She would hide the evidence. She would shred the drafts. She would play the victim card so hard the judge would probably offer her a tissue. So, I had to play the long game. Have you ever had to swallow your pride so completely that it tasted like bile in the back of your throat? Because that's what I did for the next few weeks. I went home to my apartment, which suddenly felt very small and very lonely, and I forced myself to function. I went to work. I categorized archival footage for the museum. I ate microwave meals that tasted like cardboard. But inside, I was burning. The reluctant executioner in me was screaming. I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to spend my grieving period playing detective. I wanted to mourn. Oh, I wanted to look at old photo albums and cry. I wanted to drive past the house and remember the tire swing, not calculate the property value. Linda had stolen that from me, too. She hadn't just stolen the inheritance. She had stolen the piece of my grief. About a week after the meeting, I called her. I kept my voice light, breezy. I told her I was just checking in. I asked how she was holding up. And here's where she got sloppy. Arrogance always makes people sloppy. She basically gushed. She told me she was coping by staying busy. She mentioned she was already looking at contractors to redo the kitchen. The kitchen my mom had tiled by hand. She said the old tiles were dated and depressing. I felt the heat rise up my neck, hot and prickly. I gripped the phone and told her that sounded therapeutic. I asked her what she was going to do with Dad's things, his books, his collection of vintage maps, the things that had no monetary value but meant the world to me. She paused, and in that silence, I could hear her calculating. She told me, in this dismissive, airy tone, that she had already donated most of it. She said it was too painful to have it lying around, so she sent it all to Goodwill. My stomach dropped. It felt like I was in an elevator that had just snapped its cable. All of it? The maps? The journals? The first editions he spent weekends hunting for at flea markets? Even the maps? I asked, my voice cracking despite my best efforts. She sighed, this dramatic, suffering sigh. She said, yes, even the maps. She said clutter was bad for her mental health right now. That was the first nail in her coffin. Because I knew, for a fact, that she hadn't donated them. Linda didn't donate things. Linda sold things. If it had value, it was on eBay or at a pawn shop. If it didn't have value, it was in the trash. I got off the phone and stared at the wall. I wasn't just sad anymore, and the sadness had calcified into something hard and sharp. It was a cold, clinical rage. It wasn't about the money. I could survive without the house. I had a job. I paid my rent. It was about the erasure. She was erasing him. She was taking the man who raised me and scrubbing him out of existence so she could replace him with marble countertops and a walk-in closet. I decided right then that I wasn't just going to get the house back. I was going to make sure she walked away with absolutely nothing. Not a dime. Not a single souvenir. But I needed proof. The hunch about the signature wasn't enough. The fact that the will was suspicious wasn't enough. Probate courts hate overturning wills. The burden of proof is on the accuser. I needed a smoking gun. I went to see a lawyer, a friend of a friend named Marcus. He was a cynical guy, seen it all. I sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of files, and told him the story. He listened, leaning back in his chair, tapping a pen against his chin. When I finished, he gave me a look that was half pity, half warning. He basically told me that undue influence is incredibly hard to prove. He said, unless I had a video of her holding a gun to Dad's head, or a document proving she forged it, it was her word against a dead man's signature. He said fighting this could drain my own savings, and I might still lose. And he asked me if I was sure I wanted to go down this road. I looked at him. I thought about the maps. I thought about Linda calling my dad's life clutter. I told him I was sure. He nodded. He told me that if I wanted to win, I needed to find a technicality. A mistake. A flaw in the paperwork. He told me to get my hands on the digital file if it existed. He said amateur forgers always mess up the metadata. Metadata. The digital fingerprint. And that's when it hit me. Linda wasn't tech-savvy. She was the kind of person who typed Google into the Facebook status bar. She used the same password for everything, her dog's name and her birth year. If she forged that will, she didn't do it on a typewriter. She did it on the home computer, my dad's computer, the computer that was still in the house. Have you ever felt the thrill of the hunt override the fear of getting caught? Because suddenly, I wasn't the grieving daughter anymore. I was an archivist. My entire job was finding things that people thought were lost. My entire career was built on digging through digital haystacks to find the needle. I needed to get into that house. I needed to get to that computer. And I needed to do it before she wiped the hard drive. I came up with a plan. It was simple, risky, and relied entirely on Linda's greed. I called her back 2 days later. I put on my best defeated daughter voice. I told her I had been thinking about what she said, and she was right. I told her I wanted to move on too. I told her I had a little bit of money saved up. Not much, just a few thousand, and I wanted to give it to her as a housewarming gift for the renovation. And to show there were no hard feelings. I heard the intake of breath on the other end of the line, the greed. It was like a reflex for her. She practically purred. She said that was so mature of me. She said she was so glad I was finally seeing reason. Then I dropped the hook. I told her I could come over on Saturday to drop off the check. Maybe help her move some boxes if she needed it. She hesitated. She didn't want me in the house. But the promise of free money was too strong. She agreed. But she added a caveat. She had a hair appointment at 2 p.m., so I had to come before then. Perfect. I arrived at noon. The house looked different already. The overgrown hedges Dad loved were gone, ripped out by the roots. The flower beds were trampled. Derek's car was in the driveway, leaking oil onto the pavement. Linda let me in. She was wearing a tracksuit that cost more than my car. She hugged me, and it felt like hugging a mannequin. Rigid, cold. I handed her the check. It was for $500. Not a fortune, but enough to grease the wheels. She looked at it, feigned gratitude, and tucked it into her pocket immediately. So, she said, looking around the hallway, I don't have much for you to do. Derek is handling the heavy lifting. That's fine, I said, keeping my hands clasped so she wouldn't see them shaking. I just wanted to use the bathroom, if that's okay. That drive is killer. Of course, she said, waving a hand. You know where it is. I did. It was down the hall, right next to the home office. I walked down the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I passed the bathroom. I checked over my shoulder. Linda was in the kitchen, yelling something at Derek about getting off the couch. I slipped into the office and closed the door softly. It was exactly as Dad had left it. The smell of pipe tobacco was still faint here, clinging to the curtains. His desk was cluttered with papers. And there, in the center, was the computer. An old PC tower that hummed like a lawnmower when you turned it on. I sat down. I pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life. Password required. I took a breath. I looked at the framed photo on the desk. It was Linda and her pug, Buster. I typed, Buster, 1965. Incorrect password. My heart skipped a beat. I tried a variation. Buster 1, Linda 1. Nothing. Panic started to prickle at my skin. I could hear footsteps in the hallway. I could hear Linda's voice getting closer. Sarah? You okay in there? I froze. I stared at the screen. Think. Think like Dad. He would have set up the computer originally, but Linda took over the administrative stuff years ago. What was the one thing she cared about more than money? Herself. I typed, Queen Linda. The screen went black for a second. Then the little Windows circle started spinning. Welcome. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I was in. But I wasn't safe yet. I could hear the doorknob turn. Sarah? I spun around in the chair, my heart in my throat, just as the door opened. I spun around in the chair, my heart in my throat, just as the door opened. It was Linda. She was standing there with her car keys in her hand, looking at me with this mix of suspicion and annoyance, like she'd just found a stray cat on her countertops. My hands were behind my back, blocking the screen, but I could feel the heat radiating off the monitor against my spine. Basically, I had about 3 seconds to come up with a lie that would save my entire future. I didn't try to be clever. I went straight for the emotional manipulation. I picked up the framed photo of her and the pug from the desk, the one I had just been staring at, and I held it to my chest. I made my voice wobble. I told her I was just looking for a specific picture of Dad to scan for the memorial service, something from before he got sick. And I said I wanted to remember him healthy. Her expression softened. Not out of kindness, but out of boredom. She didn't want to deal with a crying stepdaughter right before her appointment. She checked her watch, this gaudy gold thing that hung loose on her wrist, and sighed. She told me I had 10 minutes. She said Derek was in the living room if I needed anything, but she had to go, or she'd lose her spot. She told me to lock up when I left. I nodded, clutching that picture frame like a lifeline. I waited until I heard the front door close. I waited until I heard her car engine start and fade down the street. Then, just to be safe, I listened for Derek. From the living room, I heard the distinctive sound of Call of Duty gunfire and Derek shouting at the TV. He was engaged. He wasn't coming to check on me. I turned back to the computer, and the screen was still glowing. Welcome. I sat down, and my hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the mouse. I had to grip my right wrist with my left hand just to steady it. Have you ever realized that a person's entire life, their secrets, their lies, their sins, can be reduced to a list of file folders? I started digging. Linda wasn't organized in the traditional sense. She didn't use subfolders. Her desktop was a chaotic minefield of shortcuts, downloaded recipes, and random screenshots. It was a digital hoarder's paradise. I had to sift through folders named New Folder 2 and Stuff. I checked Documents. Nothing. I checked Downloads. Just endless PDF coupons. I felt a spike of panic. Maybe she deleted it. Maybe she was smarter than I thought. The fan on the computer tower whirred louder, sounding like a jet engine in the quiet room. The smell of the old carpet, dust, and stale tobacco was making me nauseous. Then I saw it, a folder on the desktop simply labeled House. I double-clicked. Inside, there were photos of paint swatches, links to contractor websites, and one Word document. Last will _ final _ v2.docx. My breath hitched. I didn't open the file immediately. As an archivist, I know that the content of a document is only half the story. The real story, the one that holds up in court, is in the metadata, the digital footprint that tells you when and how a thing came to be. I moved the cursor over the file. I right-clicked. I selected Properties. I clicked on the Details tab. The little window popped up, gray and boring and completely damning. I leaned in closer, squinting at the screen, needing to be absolutely sure. I read the text. Then I read it again. It read, Date created, October 14th, 2024, 2:14 p.m. Date modified, October 14th, 2024, 3:30 p.m. Author, Linda_admin. Last saved by, Linda_admin. I sat back in the chair. The room went silent. My dad died on October 11th. He died at 4 a.m. on the 11th. This document, this legal will that she had presented to the family, the one she claimed Dad signed with a shaky hand on his deathbed, was created 3 days after his heart stopped beating. I mean, I knew it. I knew it in my gut. But seeing it there, in black and white digital text, was different. It wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was a fact. It was a felony. I stared at the timestamp, 2:14 p.m. I remembered where I was on October 14th at 2:14 p.m. I was at the funeral home, picking out a casket. Linda had stayed home. She told me she was too distraught to come. She said she needed to be alone with her grief. She wasn't grieving, she was typing. She was sitting in this chair, probably drinking a diet soda, drafting a fake will while I was choosing the wood for my father's coffin. I didn't cry. You think you would cry in a moment like that, but you don't. The reluctant executioner took over completely. My body went into shock, but it was a cold, useful shock. My ears started ringing. A high, but piercing tone that blocked out the sound of Derek's video game. My hands, which had been shaking moments ago, went perfectly still. They were ice cold, like I had dipped them in snow, but they were steady. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my keychain. I always carry a USB drive. It's an occupational hazard. I plugged it into the tower. I didn't just copy the will. I copied everything in the folder. The renovation estimates, the emails to the bank, the photos of the house. I watched the little green progress bar fill up. 20%, 50%, 80%. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for the door to burst open, waiting for Derek to realize I had been in there too long. 100%. I ejected the drive. I shoved it deep into my jeans pocket. I stood up. My knees felt weak, like rubber, but I forced them to lock. I looked around the room one last time. I looked at the desk where my father used to sit. I looked at the spot where Linda must have sat, typing away his legacy. I got you, I whispered. I didn't mean to say it out loud, it just slipped out. I shut down the computer. I arranged the chair exactly how I found it. I wiped the mouse with my sleeve to remove my fingerprints. Maybe that was overkill. Maybe it was just too many spy movies, but I wasn't taking chances. I walked out of the office. The hallway felt longer than I remembered. The air in the house felt heavy, oppressive. I walked past the living room. Derek was still shouting at the TV, oblivious. He didn't even look up as I unlocked the front door. I stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. The light hurt my eyes. The world looked exactly the same as it had 20 minutes ago. The birds were singing. A neighbor was mowing their lawn. But everything had changed. I walked to my car, got in, and locked the doors. I didn't start the engine immediately. I just sat there, feeling the hard plastic of the USB drive pressing against my thigh. It weighed less than an ounce, but it was going to crush her. I drove straight to Marcus's office. I didn't call first, I just showed up, breathless, clutching that USB drive like it was a grenade with the pin pulled. When he plugged it into his computer and saw the metadata, he didn't say anything for a long time. He just leaned back in his leather chair, let out a low whistle, and looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "Well," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching upward, "that changes things." And here is where the shift happened. The victim, the sad, grieving daughter who just wanted her dad's maps back, died in that chair. The hunter was born. We spent the next hours strategizing. Marcus explained that we couldn't just run into court waving the USB drive. We needed to let her dig the hole deeper. This is what lawyers call detrimental reliance, but I call it giving them enough rope. Basically, if we stopped her now, the will would be thrown out. She'd get a slap on the wrist. And maybe she'd still try to claim a spousal share of the estate. But if we waited, if we let her spend her own money on the house, acting as the owner based on a fraudulent document, the court would see it as bad faith. It was risky. It meant watching her destroy my childhood home for a few more months. It meant letting her paint over my height marks on the door frame. But the payoff? The payoff would be total annihilation. So, I waited. Have you ever watched someone walk confidently toward a cliff edge, and instead of warning them, you just pulled up a chair to watch the fall? For the next 4 months, I became the perfect supportive stepdaughter. I texted Linda. I asked how the renovations were going. I told her I was so happy she was making the space her own. She ate it up. She sent me pictures. Look at the new granite countertops. Just ordered the Italian tile for the master bath. Derek loves the new media room. Every photo was a stab in the heart. Seeing my dad's study turned into a media room for her unemployed son made me want to scream into a pillow. But every photo was also a receipt. I saved them all. I created a new folder on my own laptop, The Trap. I went to the library to print everything. I didn't trust my home printer, and I certainly wasn't going to do it at work. I printed the metadata report. I printed the bank statements she had foolishly bragged about, showing the withdrawals from her personal savings to pay the contractors. I printed the text messages where she claimed Dad always wanted an open-concept kitchen. A lie. He hated open concepts. He liked doors he could close. I felt like a ghost in my own life. I'd go to work, smile at my co-workers, stamp my archival papers, and then go home and plot the destruction of my stepmother. It was a strange, bifurcated existence. On the surface, I was Sarah the archivist. Underneath, I was a silent assassin waiting for the signal. The signal came in the form of a court date, the probate hearing. It was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March. Linda had filed to finalize the estate. This was the moment she would legally become the sole owner of everything. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the city sounds outside. I felt sick. Not the I'm scared kind of sick, but the adrenaline overdose kind. My hands were cold. My stomach was churning. I kept thinking about Dad. I wondered if he would be disappointed in me for being so vindictive. But then I'd remember the safety box comment. I'd remember his watery eyes. He didn't want this for me. He didn't want her to erase us. I got up at 4 a.m. I showered. I put on my best suit. Navy blue, sharp, professional. I put my hair up. I applied my makeup carefully, hiding the dark circles under my eyes. I looked in the mirror. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like someone who had done their homework. I met Marcus at the courthouse steps at 8:30 a.m. He was holding a thick file folder. He looked calm. He handed me a coffee. "Ready?" he asked. "More than ready," I said. We walked in. The courthouse smelled like floor wax and anxiety. We went through security. We took the elevator to the 3rd floor, and there she was. Linda was sitting on a bench outside the courtroom, flanked by her lawyer, a guy who looked like he advertised on bus stops, and Derek. She was wearing black again, a modest, tasteful dress. She looked solemn. She looked like the grieving widow who just wanted to settle her affairs and go home to her memories. When she saw me, her eyes widened slightly. She wasn't expecting me. I had told her I had to work. "Sarah?" she said, her voice high and surprised. I didn't think you were coming." "I managed to get the morning off," I said, my voice smooth, devoid of emotion. "I thought I should be here. For Dad." She stiffened. She exchanged a quick, nervous glance with her lawyer. But then she recovered. She patted the spot next to her on the bench. "Well, that's sweet," she said. "It'll be over soon, honey, then we can all move on." "Yes," I said, looking her dead in the eye. "It will be over very soon." The bailiff opened the doors. "Estate of Robert Miller," he called out. Linda stood up, smoothing her dress. She picked up her expensive bag. She walked into the courtroom with her head held high, confident that she was walking toward a victory lap. She had no idea she was walking into an execution. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. It wasn't like the ones on TV with the dramatic mahogany galleries and the booming echoes. It was just a room with fluorescent lights, ugly beige carpet, and a judge who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Linda sat at the plaintiff's table with her lawyer. I sat in the back row with Marcus. We weren't technically parties to the case yet. We were just observers. But Marcus had already filed our motion to contest the will electronically that morning, timed perfectly to hit the judge's docket just before the hearing started. The judge, a stern-looking man named Judge Henderson, shuffled through some papers on his bench. He looked bored. He adjusted his glasses and peered down at Linda. "All right," he grumbled. "Estate of Robert Miller. Petition to probating the last will and testament dated October 14th. Petitioner is present?" Linda's lawyer stood up. "Yes, Your Honor. My client, Mrs. Linda Miller, is the sole beneficiary and executrix." Linda did this little performance where she dabbed her eyes with a tissue. It was subtle, but it was there. She was selling the overwhelmed widow narrative hard. "And are there any objections from heirs or interested parties?" the judge asked, purely as a formality. He clearly expected this to be a rubber stamp session. The silence in the room stretched for a heartbeat. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I could see the back of Linda's neck. She was perfectly still. Marcus stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice deep and steady. "Marcus Thorne, representing Sarah Miller, the decedent's daughter. We have a formal objection to the validity of the will." Linda whipped around in her seat. Her head snapped back so fast I thought she gave herself whiplash. She looked at me, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open. The mask of the grieving widow slipped for a second, replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. Her lawyer looked confused. He scrambled to grab a paper from his briefcase. "Objection? Your Honor, we weren't notified of any contest." "It was filed this morning, Counselor," Judge Henderson said, looking at his computer screen. He frowned, scrolling down. "Ms. Miller claims the will is a forgery?" Linda let out a gasp. It was theatrical, but you could hear the panic underneath it. "A forgery," she squeaked. "That's absurd. Robert signed that will right in front of me." "Ms. Miller, please address the court through your attorney," the judge snapped. He looked back at Marcus. "Mr. Thorne, this is a serious allegation. Do you have evidence to support this claim, or is this just a disgruntled heir fishing for a settlement?" "We have significant evidence, Your Honor," Marcus said calmly, "including digital forensic data that proves the document was created post-mortem." The heir left the room. Linda's lawyer froze. He looked at Linda. Linda looked at me. And in that moment, I saw it. The arrogance. It was still there, fighting with the fear. She truly believed she was untouchable. She believed that because she was the wife, because she had been taking care of him, she deserved it all. She didn't think I had the guts to do this. Have you ever seen a bully realize that their victim has brought a weapon to the fight? Because that look on her face, it was priceless. It was a mix of, "How dare you?" and, "Oh God." But she wasn't done. She leaned over to her lawyer and started whispering furiously. Her face was turning red. She was gesturing at me. Her lawyer stood up again, trying to regain control. "Your Honor, this is an ambush. The daughter has been fully supportive of my client for months. She's even visited the home. She's clearly just trying to extort money now that the renovations are finished." "Renovations?" The judge looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, Your Honor," the lawyer said, puffing out his chest. "My client has spent over $50,000 of her own savings improving the property, believing in good faith that she was the owner. This objection is malicious." Marcus smiled. It was a small, predatory smile. "We are not disputing the renovations, Your Honor. In fact, We are quite grateful for them. But good faith requires honesty. And creating a will 3 days after the testator's death is the definition of bad faith. The judge leaned back. He took off his glasses. He looked at Linda, then at me. Mr. Thorne, the judge said, you mentioned forensic data. I assume you have this prepared for the court? I do, Your Honor, Marcus said. I have a certified forensic report and the metadata logs. Show it, the judge said. Marcus walked up to the bench and handed the file to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The room was silent again. The only sound was the rustle of paper as Judge Henderson flipped through the report. I watched Linda. She was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was staring at the judge, trying to read his face. And she looked like a trapped animal. The arrogance was fading, replaced by a dawning horror. She knew exactly what was in that report. She knew what she had done. And for the first time, she realized that I knew what she had done. I could see the sweat starting to bead on her forehead. She reached for her water glass, and her hand shook so bad some of the water sloshed onto the table. This was it. The tension was at its peak. The slow burn was over. The explosion was about to happen. Judge Henderson stopped flipping the pages. He stared at one page for a long time. Then he looked up. His face was hard. Counselor, he said to Linda's lawyer, his voice dangerously quiet. Did you review the metadata of the will you submitted to this court? Linda's lawyer looked pale. I assumed the document provided by my client was authentic. Your Honor? Assumed, the judge repeated. He didn't sound impressed. Mrs. Miller, the judge said, looking directly at Linda. She jumped. Yes. Yes, Your Honor? Before I rule on this, he said, holding up the report, I want to give you one chance to amend your statement. Did your husband sign this document on October 14th? This was the last chance, the moment I had promised myself I would give her. If she confessed now, if she broke down and admitted she did it out of fear or panic, maybe I would have felt a shred of pity. Maybe. Linda looked at the judge. She looked at her lawyer, who was staring at his shoes. She looked at me. And she made her choice. She lifted her chin. She summoned every ounce of entitlement she had. Yes, Your Honor, she lied, her voice trembling but defiant. He signed it. I held the pen for him. The lie hung in the air, toxic and absolute. I let out a breath. Okay. No mercy. The judge stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then he looked down at the report again. Mrs. Miller, he said, his voice dropping an octave. According to the death certificate in this file, your husband passed away on October 11th. 3 days before this document was created on a computer registered to Queen Linda. The silence that followed was deafening. The silence in that courtroom wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. It felt like the air pressure had dropped about 20 degrees in a single second. You could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, a low electric buzz that sounded like a headache waiting to happen. Basically, everyone in the room was looking at Linda. And Linda looked like she had just been slapped in the face with a wet fish. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, kind of like a goldfish gasping for air, but no sound came out. Her face, which had been this mask of righteous indignation just moments ago, drained of color so fast it was actually scary. It went from flushed to gray in a heartbeat. Her lawyer, the guy with the bus stop suit, was the first one to move. He didn't look at Linda. He looked at the judge, and he looked terrified. He started stammering, basically throwing himself on the mercy of the court, saying he had no knowledge of the metadata, that he was acting solely on the information provided by his client. He was distancing himself so fast he practically left skid marks on the carpet. And here is where it gets crazy. Linda didn't back down. Not yet. She stood up. Her legs were shaking. I could see her knees knocking together against the fabric of her dress. But she pointed a finger at me. A shaking, manic finger. She started screaming. Not talking. Screaming. She yelled that I had hacked the computer. She claimed that I must have broken into the house, which, ironically, I had. But she didn't know how, and planted the file. She started rambling about how I was a jealous, ungrateful daughter who couldn't stand that my father loved her more. She was throwing every accusation she could think of against the wall, hoping something, anything would stick. It was pathetic. It was the sound of a drowning woman trying to climb up a waterfall. Judge Henderson slammed his gavel down. It made a crack like a gunshot. "Order!" he bellowed. "Mrs. Miller, sit down, or I will have you removed." She collapsed back into her chair, sobbing now. But they weren't the pretty, delicate tears from before. These were ugly, snotty, heaving sobs. The kind that ruin your makeup. Marcus, my lawyer, was the picture of calm. He stood up and asked the judge for permission to display the full timeline on the courtroom monitor, just to be absolutely clear for the record. The judge nodded. The screen on the wall flickered to life, and there it was. The trap, in high definition. Marcus walked through it, step by step, narrating Linda's crime like a documentary filmmaker. He pointed out the login times. He showed the email drafts where she sent the fake will to herself to test print it. He showed the browser history where she searched for how to write a legal will and templates for disinheriting children 2 days after Dad died. I watched Derek, her son. He was sitting in the gallery behind her. He had been playing on his phone when the hearing started, looking bored. Now he was staring at the screen with his mouth hanging open. He wasn't looking at his mom with sympathy. He was looking at her with this dawning realization that his free ride was about to end. He looked like a guy who just realized the ATM ate his card. But the best part, the part that I had been waiting for, came next. The judge turned back to Linda's lawyer. He asked if there was any defense against this evidence. The lawyer stood up, buttoned his jacket, and formally asked to withdraw from the case. He said he could not ethically represent a client who had perpetrated a fraud upon the court. He literally packed his briefcase while she was sitting right next to him. Linda grabbed his arm. She was begging him. She was whispering frantically, asking him what she should do, telling him he couldn't leave her. He pulled his arm away like she was contagious and walked out the swinging doors without looking back. She was alone. Judge Henderson looked at her over his glasses. He looked disgusted. He told her that not only was the will invalid, but he was referring the matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges regarding forgery and perjury. He ruled that the previous will, the one leaving everything to me, was the valid instrument of the estate. And then came the financial hammer blow. Linda, realizing the ship was sinking, tried one last desperate maneuver. She stood up again, wiping her face with the back of her hand, and addressed the judge directly. Her voice was small now, trembling. She basically argued that even if the will was thrown out, she had spent her life savings, over $50,000, on the house. She said she had improved the value of the estate. She demanded to be reimbursed. She said it wasn't fair for me to keep the new kitchen and the new roof that she paid for. I felt a little spike of adrenaline. This was it. The unjust enrichment trap. Marcus didn't even have to stand up. The judge looked at her with cold, hard eyes and shook his head. He explained the clean hands doctrine. He told her that the law does not reward people for their own fraud. He said that because she made those improvements based on a document she forged, she did so at her own peril. He called it officious intermeddling. He ruled that the estate owed her nothing. Zero. The renovations were considered a gift to the true owner. I saw the light go out in her eyes. It was literal. The spark of fight just vanished. She slumped forward, her forehead hitting the table. $50,000. Gone. Her retirement. Gone. Her savings. Gone. She had paid to renovate my house, and now she was being evicted from it. The judge banged the gavel. Case closed. The petitioner has 24 hours to vacate the property. The bailiff moved toward her. I stood up. I felt light. I felt like I was floating. The air in the room didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt crisp. I walked toward the exit. I had to pass her table to leave. Linda looked up as I approached. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in black streaks. She looked old. She looked tired. But mostly she looked hateful. She lunged at me. Not physically. The bailiff was too close for that. But she lunged with her words. She hissed at me. She asked me how long I knew. She asked me why I let her do it. She basically screamed in a whisper, asking why. If I knew the will was fake months ago, I let her spend every penny she had on those contractors. She said I was a monster. She said I tricked her. I stopped. I looked down at her. I thought about the map she threw away. I thought about the way she blocked me from seeing my dad. I thought about the safety box and the fear in my father's eyes when he died. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just looked at her with the same cold archival detachment I use for cataloging old receipts. I just wanted to make sure you finished painting the guest room before I kicked you out. Her jaw dropped. I turned and walked out the double doors. Behind me, I could hear the bailiff telling her to stand up. I could hear Derek asking if this meant they had to move out today. I walked into the hallway, and for the first time in 6 months, my hands weren't shaking. My ears weren't ringing. I took a deep breath. It smelled like floor wax and justice. Marcus was waiting for me by the elevators. He looked at me, impressed. "That was cold," he said. "She burned the maps, Marcus," I said. "She burned the maps." He nodded. He understood. We rode the elevator down in silence, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was the silence of a job done right. It was the silence of a ledger that had finally, perfectly balanced out to zero. I didn't go straight to the house. I gave them the full 24 hours. I didn't want to see the packing. I didn't want to see the chaos. I wanted to walk in when the dust had settled. Basically, I spent the night at a hotel, ordered room service, and slept for 12 hours straight. No nightmares. No waking up at 3 a.m. Just black, dreamless sleep. The next morning, I drove over. The repo truck was just pulling away with Derek's car. Turns out, without Linda's allowance, he couldn't make the payments. I watched it turn the corner, and I felt a little pang of satisfaction. I won't lie. I pulled into the driveway. The house looked different, better. The new roof Linda paid for looked great in the sunlight. The landscaping she had hired someone to fix up was pristine. I unlocked the front door. My key worked again, thanks to the locksmith Marcus sent over an hour prior, and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. The vanilla perfume was gone. The underlying scent of paint and new carpet was there, fresh and clean. I walked through the rooms. They had taken their furniture, obviously. The living room was empty. But the walls were perfect. A soft, creamy beige that made the room look huge. The floors were gleaming hardwood. I walked into the kitchen. The granite countertops she had bragged about were cold and smooth under my hand. The Italian tile backsplash was beautiful. She had good taste, I'll give her that. It was an expensive taste, and thanks to her greed, it was now my taste. But the house felt empty in a way that wasn't just about furniture. The hostility was gone. The heavy, a suffocating pressure that used to live in these hallways had evaporated. It was just a house again. My house. I went into the office. The computer was gone. Police evidence now. But the desk was there. I opened the top drawer. Empty. I walked to the window and looked out at the backyard. The garden was a mess of trampled flowers where they had dragged boxes out, But I could fix that. I could replant the roses. I could put the bird feeder back up. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. DA picked up the case. Fraud, forgery, and perjury. She's looking at 3 to 5 years. No bail. I stared at the screen. I thought I would feel happy. I thought I would feel triumphant. But mostly, I just felt relieved. It was over. The wolf was in a cage. Have you ever realized that revenge doesn't actually fix the past? But it sure as hell secures the future? I didn't get my dad's maps back. I didn't get those last 6 months of his life back. That hole in my chest was still there, and I knew it would probably always be there. No amount of granite countertops could fill it. But standing there in the sunlit kitchen, I realized something. I had saved his legacy. I had protected the one thing he worked his whole life for. She tried to erase him, to turn his life into a quick cash grab, and I stopped her. I walked back to the living room. I sat down on the floor in the middle of the empty room. I closed my eyes. For a second, I could smell the pipe tobacco again. I could hear the jazz music playing softly from the old stereo. I got it back, Dad. I whispered to the empty room. I got it all back. And in the silence of that house, for the first time in a long time, I felt like he heard me. I stood up, brushed the dust off my pants, and walked to the front door. I had a lot of work to do. I had to buy furniture. I had to plant a garden. I had to turn this house back into a home. But I had time. I had all the time in the world. And I had a really nice, brand new kitchen to do it in.